Documentaries reflect the times that we're in, and filmmakers are right in the middle of that. You're not immune to the changing culture. You're also not immune to the laws that are changing as well. So I'm really happy to talk today about how the current climate is shaping your visions, your logistics, and then the legality of all of that. So we have 3 filmmakers here who have been involved have been intimately involved with ongoing kind of controversial subjects that you've seen in the news, and some of them have had quite harrowing experiences. So we're really happy that you're here to talk with us today. And I want to learn how they protected themselves, how they protected the subjects, and how they protected the stories that they wanted to tell. So I'm going to start on the end with Victoria Cook, who's here with Frankfurt, Kurnit, Klein, and Selz. She's a member of the entertainment group. She's a partner, and she covers all aspects of the entertainment industry. So, Victoria, do you want to just say a few words about the changing climate and how you just told me off stage that you've had a lot of updates?
Actually, we have so much of these issues. I actually brought 2 of my colleagues in the audience, Melissa Georges and Lisa Davis, who work a ton in the documentary space also. What we've seen almost immediately, even before the inauguration, but certainly after the inauguration, was obviously a huge uptick in filmmakers wanting to make certain kinds of projects. And at the same time, it's been a really interesting year on docs, right? Like last year, Sundance was so like a boom crop of great documentaries that sold for a lot of money, and we also have a huge new amount of buyers out there. So there's lots more stuff getting made. Also, to a lot of those buyers, some of those buyers are places that never made docs before, but they have executives who feel like maybe if I made a doc, I would feel better in the course of this anxiety-producing moment we're living in. Instead of making, the stuff I usually make, I'm going to have my doc and I'm going to make that. So it's actually been, in terms of the business, a really amazing experience. There's also just so many stories to tell right now, sadly, especially for issues that impact directly law. So lots of the documentaries are actually about the law. People following immigrant rights and refugee ban type of things and cases about that. People following undocumented people living in America, people following the healthcare crisis, all different ways in which it intersects actually with what's going on at the federal and local level in the very strange world we're living in, where there's an actual attack on the rule of law by our own government. And so that's become obviously a very interesting issue. At the same time, there's been a huge uptick in litigation and claims that are coming about all of those things that are often very politically motivated. So one of the ways in which the resistance, however you call that or see that in your life, is often plays itself out is through comedy and the comic news shows. And all of them are getting sued right and left. And they all had their insurance in place for years, and they have like blanket insurance over their series. But there is something they now call the John Oliver effect. So John Oliver has been sued ad infinitum, and many of these claims are not the typical claims that would come up in traditional documentary claims, like you defame me, you didn't use, I own that, and you don't really have fair use for that. They're actually people saying things like, when you talk to me, you made me feel bad, and that's an intentional infliction of emotional distress, and in this one weird state that actually exists, so I'm bringing the claim. And insurance companies are dealing with this level of ultimately frivolous claims even before the show is beginning to be produced. So there has become a narrowing of insurance companies even willing to give E&O insurance, and the premiums when they are through the roof, and the limits are extremely low. So I'm lucky enough to work with people who actually, we have a massive amount of people dealing with us on a regular basis, so we're trying to consolidate our information and who are the insurance companies still doing it, and people actually are going to talk to the underwriters to try to see what's happening. But this is a big issue for all of you and all of you. This is get worse probably before it gets better.
And do you think that have you seen more documentary filmmakers come to you before they start a project to say, what should I have in place? What are the...
Well, one of the things that's happened is a lot of the newer buyers actually demand insurance in place with lots lots of exclusions because you haven't done all the things that need to get done to have no exclusions. But I would say now the majority of buyers require insurance at the beginning. Because a lot of them are learning that if they don't, they may never get it, and they've already spent all this money. It's one thing to not accept delivery. It's another thing to have already spent the money, right? So that's becoming an issue. So a lot of times, getting insurance before you can show what it really is only about the fear. And so that's actually making it harder sometimes too. Like if we could just shoot something, maybe they would see it and we could talk to the underwriter and explain it better, but you all don't know really what your movie is, right? Your movie is a living thing. It's, you think it's this movie and it ends up being a somewhat different movie or a totally different movie. So getting that insurance at the beginning is sometimes even trickier than getting it at the end, but from the financier standpoint, it's a risk that they're not comfortable taking unless it's there. So that has also created a lot more volume of requests of insurance that are getting denied earlier because they're like, we don't have enough information to really do that. And then once you've been denied, it's actually harder to get it later. So I don't have a perfect answer. I know people come to these panels and they like have a notebook and they like say, yeah, I'll do this and I'll do that. It doesn't actually, unfortunately, work that way. But it's really something to be aware of from the very beginning now.
That's a very good segue that you mentioned about how your film turns from one thing to a totally different thing. Katy Scoggin is here. She's a director, a producer, a camera woman, but one of the projects that you may have seen yesterday, like I did, was she spent 6 years working with Laura Poitras on Risk and then on Citizen4, which kind of came in the middle of that, which is another example of things coming out of nowhere.
Actually shot most of Risk prior to knowing that Edward Snowden even existed. And we encrypted all of our hard drives, encrypted our email, worked outside of the United States because it was unsafe to make the film here. We were worried about our footage being subpoenaed. This, by the way, was during the Obama administration. And as tricky as it is right now, if the American government is your adversary, you'd better get out of America to make your movie. And during the Trump era, the difficulties that filmmakers face in getting access have grown exponentially. I mean, E&O insurance is like the thing you do in post. I mean, that's terrifying to worry about having to get it, before shooting. I've never even heard of that. So, but I don't know how much of an intro to the trailer that was. But
that's great. I mean, I was saying when watching it yesterday, I was thinking, this movie, we'll talk about it later, but how to know when things end, because this movie, he's in the news this week and it's still relevant. It's still so relevant. So let's watch the trailer. So can you just tell us a little bit about your involvement and how you got started? And Laura Poitras is kind of the figurehead and the known person, and you hear about the dangers that she's in, or the lists that she's on, or the surveillance she's under. Were you immune to that, or were you part of that whole process? I mean, are you part of that? Are you stamped with the same kinds of, I don't even know what the word is I'm trying to say, but, what? Danger, there you go. Sure, danger.
it was, I walked out of my life for this work. I went to Berlin for about 4 weeks and came back to New York a year and a half later to live. And I did visit in between, but it was, I left in May 2013 and came back at the very tail end of 2014. But that notwithstanding, what Laura went through, being on a government watch list, being put on no-fly lists, being harassed for years every time she would come back into the United States, is unprecedented for an American documentary filmmaker like her, and I have not experienced anything at that level. To the best of my knowledge, none of our team has. It reminds me of what my Muslim friends tell me when they're traveling into the United States. This was the kind of harassment, but even, I mean, I've never been in those, behind those closed doors, but I think sometimes escalated from that.
So, as you mentioned, that was under the Obama administration. What are the thoughts now? Like, how could you even have made a film like this under the current administration, do you think?
Well, that's the tricky thing about Citizen4 and Risk. That body of work really spans three presidencies. We know that it was right after 9/11 that during the Bush years, that surveillance practices were turned against U.S. Americans in an escalated way. One of our characters from Citizen4, William Binney, stepped down from his position at NSA, quit his job, and became a whistleblower because he watched these Neris devices being pulled into where he worked at NSA and trained on U.S. Americans. The giant facility in Bluffdale, Utah, was built during this time. During the Obama administration, there was a quite known so-called war on whistleblowers, and journalists have been increasingly worried about being criticized or persecuted by the American government. And now, during the Trump years, it's hard not to feel like you're drowning with the news that keeps explosively breaking every second, and it's hard to know where even to turn or what story to tell. But this has been an ongoing issue for us.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to David Byars is here, and his directorial debut was a film called No Man's Land, which premiered at Tribeca, yes? And he was embedded in the 2016 occupation of the Malheur, is that how you say it?
Malheur.
Malheur.
It's all mispronounced anyhow, so yeah.
The National Wildlife Refuge out west, and his film is about that embedding process. Do you want to set up what we're going to see?
Yeah, sure. So I actually started making this film back in 2014 about militias as they pertain to public lands controversy, which is really kind of a thing that's happening in the American West and still ongoing. But really, it became more of a look into like the zeitgeistiness in a microcosm of the United States as 2016 progressed through. And so that's kind of what this film. It became about, at least, intellectually, if not explicitly, in the film. We don't connect those dots for the audience. We let the audience connect themselves. So that's the film that we ended up with, as it became more and more apparent that this film really represented kind of the ongoing and increasing Trumpiness of the United States.
And you made a short first, right, about something in Utah, about
I did,
a similar
yeah.
kind of militia.
Yeah, back in 2014, I made a short called Recapture about, these people protesting a federal land closure. It was basically the closure of a dirt road that was like a mile and a half long that no one was using anyhow. So it really, it pointed towards something larger, because in practice, it wasn't actually very much that was being denied them, but it was the fact that it was the long arm of the federal government as they saw it, reaching out and denying them something that they thought was their right, really kind of elevated this small closure into something much larger.
And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but did making that film give you an entree into the access that you got?
Yeah, absolutely. I met Ryan Bundy there, who figured hugely into the Malheur occupation, and then started. And that's also where my interest was I was just fascinated to see that this tiny thing could provoke such massive amounts of discontent within a very small community. There are hundreds of people that participated in this, somewhat destructive protest. They drove ATVs through this canyon that was, a riparian habitat and also home to a lot of Ute, Native American artifacts and stuff, and they destroyed a lot of stuff down in there. And so it was. That's really what kind of piqued my interest in this. And I said, there's a story here. There's something larger here. And obviously, it was a year and a half until the events at the Malheur went down. But it was, it put it on the back burner. But it was something that I wanted to make so badly, and it was really kind of struggling to figure out how to do so. And so, luckily, the Bundys took over the wildlife refuge in Oregon. It really provided kind of that narrative arc to contain this topic.
Okay, let's watch the trailer. So, can you just tell us a little bit about how long you were there? What was your process like? How did you gain access to, gain their trust to help to let you make this movie?
Sure. Like I said, I had been following this story for a little while, and I'd been reaching out to kind of the actors in this movement, this whole Patriot movement, as they call it. over the course of the year and a half. So I knew some of them, and they at least kind of were familiar with who I was. And so when I didn't have advance notice that this thing was happening, but I did show up as quickly as possible and drove straight up to the refuge, got out of my car, and
The occupation
yeah,
began?
once they took over the wildlife refuge, and drove straight up, and just got out of my car and left my camera and just said, hey, I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've been kind of following this whole topic for a couple of years. Can I film with you guys? And they were like, well, no, we don't trust the media and stuff like that. So I just kind of wore them down and put in a ton of time. And the occupation was 41 days, and I spent the majority of that with one break in the middle of it. Just hanging out with these guys away from the camera, and standing around the campfire, and sharing cigarettes. And
Was it just you?
it was just me for most of the time. I did have my producer Stash Wislocki up there for like a week, which was a wonderful reprieve, because you feel very isolated in this in this environment. But I think the reason I got some access, or got the access that I did, was that a lot of the traditional media and local news stations, they were showing up and like shoving microphones in their face and like trying to get them to say the most outrageous thing possible, and then throwing that on the news that night. And these folks they had a very specific way they wanted to be portrayed, and they weren't seeing that. And so I think for me, merely by virtue of not actually publishing anything on a day-to-day basis worked in my favor. And they kind of started opening up to me. They were like, well, this is the real truth, and they'd talk to me, and they'd be like, well, why don't you come film this and stuff. And it was really a combination of that and putting in the time. And I'm also originally from Georgia, so I think I have some redneck street cred with them. And so, I grew up around guns and stuff, and I could be like, oh, is that an AR-15 with the loophole scope or whatever, And they were like, well, why it is? Why, yes, it is, And so it was a lot of little things like that as well. And then also just kind of talking to them like they're people, and not focusing exclusively on like, well, why the guns? Are you willing to die? And stuff like that, being like, why are you here? Like what in your life like sets you off to where you're so angry that you're here? And a lot of that was this kind of talking to them and trying to understand their motivations was also something that appealed to them, because that was kind of the thing they wanted to talk about. They didn't want to talk about the guns, because they were really trying to push that narrative away and embrace more of their grievances.
Did you think about legality going in and what your responsibility would be? Would you be an accessory? Would you be, did you have any of those thoughts going in? Did you talk to a person like Victoria ahead of time?
I did talk to a lawyer, but this was actually months before the events happened, and I really didn't have time, like once it went down, to call a lawyer. And I really honestly didn't even think of that. I was trying to find a camera when I got there. And so I didn't really talk to anyone of the legality of it. And that was something that was in the back of my mind the entire time, was maybe I should be talking to a lawyer and figuring out if somehow by being here I'm culpable or guilty of criminal trespass or something like that. And I wasn't sure. I mean, the final product being that the Department of Justice just didn't pay attention to any journalists whatsoever, besides to like reach out to us and try to get us to like turn over footage and stuff like that. But really, it was just so day to day, and like thinking this thing was going to end any moment, and like time was so precious on the ground there that I didn't really have time or anyone else to figure out the whole legality of me being there.
That's a great segue to Deia Schlosberg, who is our fourth panelist here. She has been following climate change activists, I guess is that the way to say it, for a number of years, and she actually was arrested about a little over a year ago in North Dakota when she was filming activists shutting down some of the pipeline sands, the Trans-Canada sands. I'm trying to get this right. But why don't you tell us a little bit about that experience, and then we'll go into the Reluctant Radical as well.
Sure. So shortly after Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! Filmed the private contractors with their dogs at Standing Rock attacking some of the protesters there. Well, that kind of sets the context for when this all happened. But there was a pipeline protest planned. Essentially, a small group of activists wanted to shut down all of the tar sands oils coming in from Canada, and there are 5 pipelines that transport those tar sands. So 5 activists were going to go and in turn manually shut off the emergency shut-off valves on these 5 pipelines, closing off all tar sands coming to the U.S., and that represents 15% of U.S. oil consumption for a day. So I had been covering all different environmental, social justice, climate-related issues in various projects over the years. I heard this was going to be happening. I knew that I knew that mainstream wouldn't be covering this. I saw how Amy and the Democracy Now! Crew was treated because they were covering protesters and their treatment, and just knew that it was really important to get this story out. So I went to North Dakota to film it. There was 4 states, Montana, North Dakota, Washington State, and Minnesota, where the pipelines crossed in, and I went to the North Dakota site to cover that activist and the shutting down of the Keystone pipeline there. And I wasn't part of the action. I just knew it was important to cover. And so they did the action. They had done the research to make sure it would be safe. They called the pipeline companies ahead of time to tell them what they were doing and say, take any necessary precautions, but we will be closing these valves. So that all went down. The activists stayed there. They weren't trying to hide anything. They stayed there to be arrested. And I was filming the whole thing. And before going in, I knew that what they were doing was extremely controversial and they were going to be arrested. And I did a lot of research on my rights as a filmmaker, and I was very, very careful not to break any laws and to be completely aware of my rights and not cross any lines. And that kind of didn't matter at all. The police just kind of scooped me up as they arrested the activists, and my thinking then was like, all right, they don't know exactly what's going on and what my involvement is, whatever, it'll get straightened out. But I ended up spending 3 days alone in the North Dakota jail, not having any idea what was going on, what they were charging me with. They confiscated my gear and footage, and at the end of those 3 days, they gave me my charges, and it was 3 counts of felony conspiracy, a 20-year charge, a 20-year charge, and a 5-year charge, maximum sentences. So that was the whole world I had not at all anticipated being in.
So there weren't other journalists arrested that day? It was only you?
Not in North Dakota, but there were other journalists covering the action as it was happening in the other states. So there's a filmmaker, Lindsay Grazel, who was working on this documentary that you'll see the trailer of, called The Reluctant Radical. She had been filming the activists that shut down the Washington pipeline for a year and a half before that action, and was just covering yet another action he was taking. She was arrested and charged with multi-decadal felonies. Her cameraman was arrested and charged with felonies. And then the cameraman who I've worked with on other projects that was filming in Minnesota was later charged. He was mailed charges after the fact. And
so, in the difference between these 2 cases, maybe Victoria, you can chime in. Is it up to the local government about whether they determine that this, how they differentiate journalism versus documentary, or is that not even relevant?
It's for First Amendment. It's First Amendment, and
right.
That was a major point that I try to make, is that if First Amendment nitpicks about your credentials, then that like every citizen has that right. It doesn't matter if you have a press pass. Like if you as a citizen have a right to free speech and to document, as long as you're not breaking any other laws. You can't trespass, you can't harm anybody. But if you're on public property, there's no.
And you were on public.
I was on a public road, yeah.
But the facts don't matter for charging, right? Or for even sometimes how things go down. So if you have...
I think you need to put the mic a little.
Oh, hi? Better? I mean, the facts, you stated that perfectly, but that didn't matter for you. And it doesn't matter for a lot of people depending where you are. So, we often give people advice based on what the law is, but the law is going to be... The people who choose to enforce different things do it at their discretion a lot of times. So lots of filmmakers are breaking the law a lot of the time on projects that are either less controversial, more in hidden places where no one's seeing them do it, or where there's less to lose on the part of the authority figures. In that situation, it could not be more of the mechanisms of power that drive our country, right? As fossil fuels, as all that stuff. It's at the time of a huge actual beginning of a revolutionary feeling that people are genuinely scared of. And so I'm sure they said you trespassed even though you knew you didn't, or whatever they said, or you conspired with these people and you were really part of them, not a separate journalist. And yes, a journalist, you could be a filmmaker, you could be a fourth grader on, in your school paper. But it's about the climate, right? And so I think that brings us back to that wasn't even during, right? That was not during the administration.
Right.
That was, so this is during Obama.
It was a month before that.
This is if we could only go back, it'd be great. But it's not like these things, it's just scarier now, and there's more stories to tell, and there's ways in which there is economic pressure being placed on things by these claims on, for insurance, for all different ways of people being scared to open their doors. They don't want to get involved. So there's different ways that speech is being squelched. But it's not like it's new to the Trump administration. So.
And then Deia, you also, there's a lot of other things we could talk about here. You have your current project that you're working on now called, which I don't know if we should show the Reluctant Radical first.
Yeah, let's jump into Reluctant Radical.
Okay, and then we'll come back.
Lindsay had been making this film for a while before I came on board, and the
woman who was arrested in Washington, right, at the same time, yeah.
And we actually met because we were both arrested filming the same action at the same time, and got in touch and realized we would work really well together. And so I came on board Reluctant Radical as a co-producer.
So let's see the clip, please. So you're in post-production now on this, or is it? It's pretty much locked and submitted and waiting to hear. When that process was happening, that was this year, I'm assuming. Did things seem different in your mind under the new administration? Is what I'm thinking. Did you do anything different or ask any different kinds of questions about your filmmaking process?
I think we were just more adamant that we push it out there as strong as possible. I think one of the main goals of the current administration is to squelch resistance and people speaking out. And I think for this lot, that only serves to make us want to do it more. So
I'm glad. That's great. Katy, can you tell us a little bit about how, if or how the current administration has changed your ideas about what kinds of stories you want to tell, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about your new project, Flood.
Sure. I think it struck a chord with a lot of filmmakers, writers, journalists. I've started looking inward. The project that I'm making on right now, my feature, is about my own family. My dad and I, my evangelical father and I, are the main characters. So I have stepped outside of my comfort zone behind the camera and I've turned it around on myself and my family. And two things have been really key in making this film. Stuff that David actually brought up, timeline and trust. I've absolutely needed to be embedded with my family for about the last year in order to get the kind of footage that I need to tell this story. And I've also needed to regain my father's trust. He is a Trump supporter. We have had periods of estrangement, but it's my dad. I love him, and I wanted to kind of find a way to reach across the divide and understand him. And doing that has been one of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life. But it's also required me to change and to realize that as a feminist, progressive woman who's decided to live in New York City, there are certain assumptions that I make about Trump supporters, about conservatives, about Christians that are simply wrong. And so that's kind of what I've been working on.
Were you thinking about this film for years, or was this something that really was triggered by the election and the aftermath or the foremath, whatever?
It's definitely been heightened by the election. The 2016 election, I shot on the campaign trail as a camerawoman. So I felt like I shot dozens of Trump rallies, and I felt like I was an eyewitness to this kind of downward spiral that was happening in the country. Meanwhile, my father is watching from home on Fox News. He's looking at the canned media talking heads, and it really pissed me off deeply that he wouldn't take my word for it as an eyewitness that this guy was a bastard and that he was a demagogue and that really bad things were going to happen in the United States if he was elected. But the film is frankly an adaptation of my NYU thesis film, which is a fictionalized short shot on 35 millimeter back in 2012. I was writing fictionalized characters based on my father and myself. And at a certain point during that narrative script writing journey, I realized, the real characters are Dad and me, so I better just kind of dive into this thing. So.
Fascinating. So there's a similarity. Well, I'm going to make some assumptions, but David, you were embedded with people with whom you may not have 100% agreed. Is that the case? Okay.
That is the case, yeah.
I've seen the film. I think that's fair assessment. But how do you reconcile that? You had to get their trust.
Right.
And so did you explicitly tell them you didn't agree with them? Did you tell them you did agree with them?
In terms of that, in terms of how I represented myself to them, I never ever wanted to lie to them just for my own personal sake. I would have too much guilt, I think. And we were able to find. Some of them would listen to me when I disagreed with them. Some of them would be like, "Oh no, get out of here," liberal media and stuff like that. And I would make jokes like that. I'd knock on the door and come in and be like, "Liberal media, stop talking about secret stuff," And they thought it was kind of funny or whatever. But we did find kind of little islands of agreement. A specific example is like the militarization of the police. They're very much against that, and I'm like, hey, right there with you, bro. And so we found little islands like that. And then also, when we were drilling down to like, they thought, their version of America was, at risk, in danger. And I'm like, yeah, there's, people all over the political spectrum who feel that way, especially right now, so I can identify with that. And so there was talking to them. And I'm not, and again, I'm from Georgia and like grew up surrounded by conservatives, so I don't necessarily, we tend to caricature our opponents, especially now, and then, take the worst examples of them and say, that's what this is, that's what they are. And I didn't even have to pierce that stereotype because I grew up around conservatives who were very loving and normal people and whatnot. I disagree with them, but so there was that kind of. That was evident in my approach to them, as well as just talking to them in terms that I could understand and they could understand, and finding just ways to communicate. And I'm sure that's been your experience for the whole last year. By the way, I'm extremely excited you're making that film. It's just it really was just kind of spending time and talking and spending more time. So,
Katy, was your father immediately on board with this, or was he a reluctant non-radical? I don't know.
He was we're radicals in our own right in the Scoggin family. He was He was reluctant, and I was reluctant. I did a ton of foot dragging. I think I wrote 5 drafts of a feature script. It was like the best procrastination I've ever engaged in. I mean, it helped me to put this movie off for probably 3 or 4 years. But the turn happened when I put a lav on him. Like if you're putting a microphone on a character, it's this very intimate act. Or you're putting a wire on somebody. You can hear them breathe. Sometimes you can hear their heartbeat. It's just a very private thing, and you have to have somebody's trust in order to do that. And I sort of sneak attacked my dad with a vampire clip on a lav at one point, and he said, is somebody giving someone the 3rd degree? But we sort of eased into it.
Now he's on board with us.
Yeah, the first thing I did was to film in his 4th grade math and science classroom. He is a young Earth creationist. And he teaches math and science, and has for 25 years. I was nervous about what I would hear him teaching in his public school science classroom, but actually it was very sound curriculum, and he's a fabulous teacher. So, yeah.
One of the other things that is kind of hard to not talk about this year is the proliferation of the fake news argument, and how. And I just am curious to hear how you guys think that might affect the work that you're doing, or the way that people interpret what you put on the screen, because nothing's ever completely subjective, or objective, excuse me. But I don't know, how has that come up at all in terms of what you're talking about, Deia?
I think that's a big reason that documentary is taking off so much right now, because we can show nuance, we can show things unfolding that it's a lot harder to put spin on than fake news and mainstream news stories that can be, more easily manipulated and distrusted and questioned. So I think, I feel like we as documentary filmmakers have a responsibility to show different angles on stories that can speak to the truth, I think, a lot clearer.
I was involved in something really interesting that was very close
Mike,
I was involved in a film recently that was very close to my heart. I grew up in Orthodox Jewish world, not ultra-Orthodox, but modern Orthodox, and my clients, Heidi Ewing and Rachel Grady, made a movie called One of Us about the ultra-Orthodox, about 3 people leaving various elements of the ultra-Orthodox community here in Brooklyn. And when the movie started, which is now several years ago, it was the goal, almost all filmmakers' goal, was that it would be a limited theatrical release before other things would happen. But they were also lucky enough to have Netflix come on board early. And what turned out to be was kind of amazing is that certain aspects of the community tried really hard to call it fake news and malign it in certain ways, and so they couldn't really say it's fake, but they could say these are anti-Semitic, and an anti-Semite and a self-hating woman who decided to malign the community. But what was amazing was that it was seen so much already because of the massive ability to get it into people's smartphones that they're not allowed to have, but they all have. And people were able to watch the movie. So the ways in which parts of the community wanted to call it fake news in a metaphorical way, they couldn't, because too many people had already seen it, and it already meant something to people in a really emotional way. So I think that part of what has to happen is figuring out a way, and I know there's lots of complicated business problems and challenges in this, but we can't be the only people seeing these movies. The people who need to see the movies need to see the movies. So obviously you're making a movie about that very thing, but part of it is, if God willing, I get to see your movie in January, it's going to be people like me seeing your movie in January. And part of the problem is it will not matter. They don't need to call it fake news if they never see it. Right. So I think part of it is figuring out ways as a community in the age of Trump, where we all mainly live in echo chambers unless we're back on Thanksgiving with people we don't necessarily agree with. How can we get people to see the movies, let alone call it fake news? Let them at least see it. And I'm not sure we're in a place where we're doing that from a distribution point of view.
Right, they're way more likely to call it fake news if they haven't seen it and experienced it and live with it. I think we need to go to the Q&A in the audience. And so do you guys have some questions for our panel? Anyone? Yes, right here.
How do you combat the idea that no one from the distributors don't want to hear issue-oriented pitches? And then they want to hear, human interest stories, and from a doc world, to find a doc that's not rooted originally in an issue. Like, is the idea to dance around the issue and really stress the human, or should you just be forcing your way into the right rooms, being like, this is an important issue, I'm not going to dance around it?
I'm just going to summarize. So she's asking about asking, or in your pitches, will distributors shy away from issues-oriented films, and should you focus more on human interest side of things, or pitch it that way? Is that a fair kind of?
I think the new buyers really care about issue-oriented things. Like I have clients selling things to like Paramount Television, and because those buyers don't actually know how to actually be an executive on a documentary, they want the issue to lead everything and don't actually understand storytelling or how you find a subject and think they're going to see dailies and stuff like that. And you can really pitch an issue to like individual executives at those places. But I mean, obviously the filmmakers should talk about it, but there is no issue that matters if there's no subjects that are interesting or important. So I would never recommend, just as a rep, to pitch something based on the issue. The issue should be embedded in it, not the way you pitch it.
It's
Unless
still a
you're
human
pitching to-
interest. Everything's a human interest story if you're telling
Yeah.
someone's story. Do you guys have anything to add?
Oh, I think, pitching a film is so low percentage of success anyhow. Trying to get something made is always an uphill battle that, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that you pitch it any way you can, and you kind of tailor it to who you're talking to as well, like cynically speaking, but also you know in your mind and in your heart, like, what the film is you want to be making anyhow. So hope there aren't any gatekeepers in here or anything like that, distributors. But that's kind of my 2 cents on the issue.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the group of you could go through some specific things to keep in mind when you're trying to cover all your legal bases. I know with Deia, I think it's helpful for people to know about, like, an obligation to report, that kind of stuff that you found out.
He's asking about some specific legal actions that you could take to protect yourself and your film and your subjects. That was one of my questions that I didn't get to.
So this is where I actually feel like I brought a call. We have the call, whatever that game show is, because I actually don't do this part that much. I do a lot of
Call a friend.
Yeah, call a friend.
Yeah.
I do a lot of the structuring and kind of getting access and all different kinds of things. But when it comes to very specific issues, I'm lucky enough to have a whole department that's literally all they do. So I thought Melissa could actually give
Deborah's going to give her a mic.
seconds or minutes about kind of like best practices in terms of issues like protecting your footage, stuff like that.
Melissa, can you stand up and?
Sure. I think she heard her foot.
I think one of the issues that a lot of documentary filmmakers go through is the trespass issue and whether or not what they're doing is legal or not legal. And by the way, if you have more specifics about what you want to know about, I can certainly address them. I think the answer to that one is it's not a good documentary film if you didn't do something wrong, probably somewhere along the way. Always leave if you're asked to leave. Stop filming when you're asked to stop filming. Don't let anybody take your footage to the extent that you have control over that. Know where you're going, get a sense of what the rules are in terms of locations. And, if you're lucky enough to have a lawyer on board, if you know that you want to do something like surreptitious filming, hidden cameras, misrepresenting who you are, there are lots of laws. The laws can be different state to state about those kinds of activities. But it is a good idea if you're doing something involving any sort of hidden filming or saying you're not a filmmaker in order to get the footage. There are obviously ramifications for that depending upon where you are. So it's a good idea. The more controversial the filming is, to be able to speak to a lawyer and to get some thoughts on how to get around those things, not get thrown in jail and or not get thrown out of a place and get the footage that you want. Did that sort of answer the question, or I can? talk about other things too, if you have more specific question.
I was just like looking for general bits of wisdom that everyone's run into. I know Deia's got a couple that I'm her partner, and we ran into a couple revelations. We were dealing with ramifications. But yeah, I don't have any specific things on that. Just in general, what's popped out in your position.
Do you guys have any lessons that you've learned from your experiences that you would, some pieces of advice?
You go ahead.
For you guys, if you're concerned about source protection, I would say absolutely learn and use PGP for email. It's very simple. You can, I use it with the mail application on my Mac.
That's encrypting?
It's encryption for email. PGP stands for Pretty Good Privacy. It's open source, it's free, it's very simple. A lot of Americans don't take the steps to use stuff like this, but I think it's, at this point in time, particularly for source protection, it's really vital and important.
Deia, did you have any takeaways from?
I have a lot of takeaways. I don't know, the first thing that pops into my mind is once you get into the legal system, it's long game. I know I was freaking out, super panicky when my arrest happened and when this all went down, and it was really overwhelming. But there are amazing lawyers that have our backs that will help with these issues. And thank you for saying it's not a good film unless you get in some sort of trouble for it. Because these stories need to get out there, and
And you're not out of the woods yet, am I?
Well, I'm out of the North Dakotan woods. My charges have been dropped in North Dakota. It took almost a year for that whole process to happen. Recently, 84 Congress people have written Jeff Sessions saying, "Are you aware of this action that these people took on the tar sands pipelines last October? And why are you not pressing federal terrorism charges?" And we did some research, and they all, in fact, get a lot of funding from the fossil fuel industry, coincidentally. But so that's a whole new can of worms if they decide to pick up federal charges.
Is there a statute of limitations on the charges that you?
I'm not sure. Yeah. I'm not sure.
I think domestic terrorism is, I don't even think it has a statute of limitations.
That's what I would guess.
And actually, that's what we've used. Most of the time, the domestic terrorism has been charged against actually environmental activists. It's actually a strange thing.
There was that Marshall Curry film.
Yeah.
That, yeah.
I was trying to get at the thing that surprised me was the obligation to report thing that we found out. If you know about a crime.
Oh.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Okay, so were you guys here for the ethics panel this morning? Because they talked a little bit about this obligation to report, and also just being filming a subject breaking a law. Yeah.
Knowing about a crime, you don't have to, unless you're a mandated reporter, like a teacher or social worker, somebody that finds out about abuse. You don't, barring that, you do not have to report anything you know. If you know of a crime that's going to be committed or a crime that is in progress, as a citizen, you are under no obligation to tell anybody.
Fascinating.
But you can be subpoenaed.
Right. Are there other questions? Yes, right here.
If it's okay, can you elaborate a little bit on your arrest when you talked about getting a good lawyer? How did you go about that? Taking measures to protect yourself from travel? Did you have a plan before or something that developed? Did you do it there alone?
The question is about whether Deia, how did she get a good lawyer involved quickly, and then were there measures she could have taken beforehand to protect herself?
I certainly could have taken more measures beforehand to protect myself. I feel like I was incredibly naive going in. I think, well, I've been working closely with Josh Fox on a couple couple films prior to these events going on. And when he found out that I had been arrested and was in jail, he went all over social media and got a lot of people involved in speaking out, and it became pretty widely publicized. And because of that, I had a really amazing civil rights lawyer in New York, Ron Kuby, come on board and say he would help pro bono. And so he worked with a lawyer in North Dakota, and they did a wonderful job. But I think because it was fairly high profile, because it was seemingly such a cut and dry First Amendment case, it wasn't hard for me to get pro bono help. But yeah.
In terms of things that you could have done to protect yourself, was there anything other than not filming? I mean, I don't know. No.
I think I just meant more about, you said you researched your rights a lot before you did it.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had that in mind, how long it took you to get in touch with them before you knew everything.
Josh reached out to him while I was still in jail, I believe, or perhaps Kyle reached out to him while I was still in jail. Kyle and Conrad were my jail support team, and they were amazing.
Something that is something to do if you go, I mean, even in protesting in general, even if you're not just going, there's usually legal support at almost all places. Like if you go to protest and you intend to get arrested, which happens a lot, there's usually a legal observer. And sometimes it's good if you actually take someone extra, it doesn't have to be a lawyer, who is not participating, seems further enough away, who at least can then call the people who need to get called, and having a relationship with a criminal defense lawyer, not only your entertainment lawyer, is, if you're going to do something at this level, is probably a good idea. Like someone you can call locally who can at least appear for you and bail you out. And that's probably worth having bail money in your budget.
David, did you do anything before you were embedded yourself in Oregon, or did you? I mean, you just went.
I just went. Yeah, the amount of what I didn't know and still don't know is kind of infinite. And and Deia mentioned that she thought she was naive, and I just think that the amount that we don't know as filmmakers about the legal system, or any layperson, or a lot of lawyers, is infinite. So it's really hard to hedge against every single legal risk out there. And that's just, and again, that's coming from a point of ignorance, so maybe there is, but what's that?
There isn't.
Yeah, and so I think it comes down to having a relationship with a lawyer and trying to do the best that you can, rather than having some kind of watertight or airtight strategy to avoid any kind of missteps that you wouldn't.
This is maybe a little sensitive, but I also just am struck by looking at us all and that we're all white people up here, and that if you were a person of color, there are other kinds of risks that you might be feeling that are very real. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. The 5 activists, the valve turners, as they call themselves, that took that action they always make that point. They're all older white people, and they're very clear that that's not, that the action they took, they had the privilege of taking. Right. And yeah.
Can I mention something else just in response to your question? Just because there have been some occasions when I've crossed back into the U.S. border without anything on me except for attorneys' numbers written down on a piece of paper in my pocket. I think it can be extremely important to have some kind of legal representation. If you know you're going into something where you might get arrested, or you might have your phone, your computer, your hard drives confiscated, you should have an ACLU attorney or an EFF attorney. Somebody needs to have your back legally. Carry a phone from
What's
which you
EFF?
Electronic Frontier Foundation. You should carry a phone from which you can take the battery out. As some people might call this a burner. It can be a really good idea, pay as you go, in case it gets confiscated. And you should try to back up footage and hide it somewhere. If you have somebody at a location where you're filming and you can pass off a hard drive to somebody to put it in a secure location, do that, just in case you're worried about your camera, your SD cards, or whatever you're shooting on, or your footage being confiscated. Laptops, as well. Have like a backup of your laptop that you can keep in a separate location.
Not on the cloud, like an actual hard.
Oh, God, no.
I know that was the answer. I just I had to say it.
You should also just, even on your, when you travel, if you're doing things like this, make sure you, like, even if you're not going to go to that extent, you should take off the ability to put your thumb on it. That opens it up, because they usually don't have a right. They might still try to force you to put in your code to open up things, but if you can just go like this, they say they feel like they can do that more and make you do that, and the next thing you know, they have access to stuff. So.
I'm just picturing Edward Snowden under the blanket in Citizen 4. Yeah. All right, I think we have time for one more. Deborah's pointing at someone? Oh, just back in the back. Yes, over there, please. No, I was actually talking to her, right there. Yes.
I kind of wanted the flip side of filmmaking in the Trump era, and like opportunities now for misrepresented or underrepresented communities to have urgency of their stories being told, and like avenues to kind of get those stories out and stuff like that.
Did you all hear that? She's asking about the flip side of the Trump era, and there might be more opportunities for filmmakers of color and people of color to have their stories told, underrepresented groups to have their stories told. It's a great question.
I mean, yeah, like everything feels so threatened now, and then I think it's kind of been a gut check for everyone and been like, oh, well, maybe we were enjoying this kind of complacency and ignoring those underrepresented voices that we can't really afford to do anymore, and those need to be more prominent in our discourse, because the people who are for lack of a better word, who are the gatekeepers of what is getting made, what's not getting made. I think it just prompted a lot of soul searching. So I think you're right. I think there's an opportunity to do that, and there's energy to do it as well. Like, more importantly, like the biggest silver lining out of the November of 2016 is the energy that we've seen come out of this. And so I think you're absolutely right that there is an opportunity there, and it's being taken advantage of, which is really heartening to see.
Is there more funding for those kinds of stories, do you think?
Definitely. There's so many more buyers. Like, there's outlets that are now turning towards nonfiction storytelling to begin with, and long form and episodic nonfiction storytelling, who have an ever increasing need for content. And a lot of those places are part of the we would think of as traditional journalism, like BuzzFeed and things like that, who are doing more long-form stuff because they understand it's a way to tell a real story. And so there's a lot more buyers, I think. Facebook.
And I'm sorry we didn't get to Deia's next project, which sounds really fascinating too. So, Bootstraps, you look it up, right? I want to thank you guys so much for taking part in this conversation. And you can watch Risk on Showtime. Where is No Man's Land available on? It's
available on Amazon and iTunes right now. It'll be on Amazon Prime at the end of December. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say that or not. And then somewhere else next May that I don't think I'm allowed to say either. But let's just say it's
coming.
Free to the public.
Okay.
So.
And one of us is I watched one of us on Netflix, the movie that Victoria was talking about, the Rachel Grady and Heidi Ewing movie. You can watch that on Netflix now. Do you want to plug anything, Deia, before? Hopefully we'll see your movie soon.
Just that another flip side of the Trump era thing is because there are like crazy, scary headlines every single day. I think it's I don't know, opened up an opportunity for us to focus on like occasionally more. Sorry. What my partner and I, Conrad, wanted to do was really spotlight solutions and positive stories, because we're getting bombarded by incredulousness every day. So we just tried to flip that a little with this next project.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for ending on a positive note.